So in 1 Samuel chapter 17, the account of David and Goliath um, sometimes gets reduced by folks to an underdog story. And it's not. I'll just be blunt with you. It's not an underdog story. Unless we're calling Goliath the underdog and the underdog lost, because that's the only way this is an underdog story. David did not go into this battle as the less likely to win. David went into this battle as one who served God and therefore was victorious. And so it's not an underdog story. The story of David and Goliath is about faith and about the kind of faith that I guess we could describe as radical and paradigm shifting, because it changes the whole perspective when David shows up with faith. You know, before he's there, everybody's terrified of Goliath and paralyzed about Goliath. And then David shows up and Israel wins because of faith. And it's one of many Old Testament narratives that teach us that we need to trust in the Lord and not trust in ourselves. And so, as we discuss this, where I want us to begin is with a statement made by the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7. He says, "For we walk by faith and not by sight." And as we've got the question on the board there, do we walk by faith or do we walk by sight? Because which we walk by is going to determine a whole lot about what goes on in life and whether we find ourselves victorious like David was, or struggling and fearful like the rest of Israel was. This is the plan. This is what God expects, and what he wants of us is that we walk by faith. So understand what's going on in the context here. Daily, this Philistine comes out, and he's a giant of a man. We'll talk about how big he is in just a moment. But he comes out and he challenges the camp of Israel. And his challenge is this, and this is back at verse 8 in the context: choose a man for yourselves. He's suggesting we don't need to all go to battle. Just, you choose your champion. And obviously, I'm the champion of the Philistines. And we'll just duke it out, the two of us. And whoever wins, then that side wins. And if it's we win, then you become our servants. And if you win, then we become your servants. In verse 10, he says, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." And he does this, verse 16 tells us, evening and morning for 40 days. 40 days of him showing up in the morning and challenging, and then going back to his armchair or whatever he was sitting in. And then he comes back out in the evening and again puts forth the same challenge. And nobody takes him up on this challenge. There is no champion to step forward from Israel's ranks. In fact, if we look at the men of Israel, look at the descriptions. Verse 11, Saul and all Israel were dismayed and greatly afraid. That's not going to be helpful in battle against the giant. In verse 24, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So this is across the board. We've got the army of Israel. These are the best of the best. These are the fighting men who fight alongside the king. And everybody, including the king, is terrified. They saw this man who stood opposite them. The description is that he is 6 cubits and a span in height. 6 cubits and a span is 9'9". Now, that looks like that can't be it, right? If he is 9'9" in this image, the Israelite there is 5'3". And if you go back and you check through archaeology and archaeological digs and so forth around that time, that seems to be the kind of height that you would expect among an average Israelite male. The range is something like 5 foot to 5'6", but the average is 5'3". When I scaled that out, he is 5'3", he is 9'9". Can you imagine seeing that guy on the other side? And this is who one man has to go and fight. One man. You can't take 5 of you. You can't take 10. One. And so they're afraid. When David shows up at the scene, understand this, David sees the same thing. It's not like the giant shrunk somehow when David showed up, right? He sees the same giant. Goliath is just as big for him. But he reframes the whole situation in spiritual terms. See, it's not Goliath's size that is the issue for David. When David shows up, the problem is that this giant is an offense against God and has spoken out against the Lord. And so in verse 26, what David says is this: who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? I don't know what time of day David showed up, but it would seem that he likely heard Goliath's challenge, or somebody told him about Goliath's challenge. He comes out every morning and every evening. He says the same thing. And David's conclusion is, who does he think he is to defy the armies of the living God? And what he does when David says this, he is speaking, confidently, because he has faith in God. This is not a political thing. This is not about that nation and this nation. This isn't a military battle thing. This is spiritual in nature. And that giant is speaking out against our God. Now, faith can sometimes be misinterpreted by those who don't have it as pride or arrogance. And so you display faith in God, and people misunderstand that or misconstrue that. And so Eliab does that. Eliab is David's oldest brother. And so Eliab, when he hears David speaking, he's angry with David, and he actually rebukes him in verse 28. Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. He just dresses him down. He questions his purpose in being there. Well, if you read the whole context, he's there because his father sent him there. He's obeying what his father said to do. That's why he showed up. But Eliab belittles the work that he does. We got important things to do, boy. You go take care of those few sheep that you're taking care of, right? Okay, well, Eliab, what important thing are you doing right now? You're shaking in your boots. That's what you're doing, right? And David's not, which I'm sure is an offense to Eliab in and of itself. He accuses him of being lofty and audacious, and David, you're arrogant, you're prideful, you're insolent, all of those kinds of things. And again, that's not it at all. David was confident, and he spoke with resolve and certainty because he had faith in God. This is not David about David. This is David about God. And God is able to bring victory, and therefore he's able to speak in the way that he does. Well, David's confidence gets reported to the king. And so Saul hears about this young man who is in the camp, who is saying that this giant needs to be brought down. Now remember, Saul and all Israel were dismayed and greatly afraid, right? Saul is afraid as well. David bluntly says in verse 32 to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." So this is David now in front of the king. Hey, don't worry. I will go and take care of him. And Saul immediately contradicts David. He says, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. Now, there's several dynamic equivalence translations that use the word boy there instead of youth. And it is a valid translation so long as we understand what's meant by boy. Sometimes you'll see these artistic renditions of it, and we've got this little 5 or 6 year old David in front of a big giant, right? That's not what is happening here. 5 or 6 year old David was not coming up against the giant. 5 and 6 year old David also was not taking care of his father's sheep out in the wilderness and fighting bears and lions. Okay? So we're not talking about a young boy. The word boy, according to Strong's, or the Hebrew word that's used here, that would some translations say is boy, is a boy from the age of infancy to adolescence. He's a teenager. That's what he is. He's a teenager. And so Saul, he's looking at this comparative to him. He's a young boy. And you can't go and defeat him. Saul is head and shoulders above everybody else in Israel, and he's terrified to go and meet with the giant. But it's interesting that the same terminology is used of David as is used of Goliath. You see, you can't defeat him because you are a youth. Saul looks at David as nothing more than a boy. He's an untrained boy. He's not going to be able to go and fight against him. And yet, what does he say about Goliath? Goliath is a trained warrior since his youth. So David's present reality of being young is perceived as a limitation, whereas Goliath's youth, which was a past reality, is conveyed as a matter of pedigree. You remember when Paul is writing to Timothy, he says, let no one despise your youth, right? We need to understand that young people are able and not get in their way. And when a young person comes and they're demonstrating faith, you don't get rid of their faith. You don't try and squash their faith. You encourage their faith. But the problem here is Saul doesn't have faith. And Eliab doesn't have faith. And all the men of war of Israel don't have faith. Well, David's not discouraged by Saul's attempt to dismiss him. He actually gives evidence to the king. Verse 34 through 36, when I was watching my father's sheep out in the fields, occasionally a wild beast would come and would take one of the sheep, would actually have the sheep in his mouth, and I'd go chase down that wild animal, and I would rescue the sheep from the mouth of the beast. Not from a distance. You can't do that from a distance. When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it and killed it. You can't catch the beard of a lion from a distance. You have to be right there face to face with the lion. David has faced lions. He has faced bears. And his confidence here, again, is not in his own ability or power, but apparently Saul needs to hear that he's actually done something. And so he presents that as evidence for Saul that he's done something, but his confidence is anchored in the Lord and his ability to deliver him. And in fact, in verse 37, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear. Did you hear how he began that? The Lord who delivered me. David's not saying it's about me. He's saying it's about the Lord. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the bear, the paw of the lion, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Just as the bear fell, just as the lion fell, so will the Philistine fall. Well, having heard David's explanation of his faith in God, Saul simply said, "Go, and the Lord be with you." That sounds good, doesn't it? Go, and the Lord be with you. That's the kind of thing that one faithful person says to another faithful person, right? Go and the Lord be with you. In fact, Boaz said that to the reapers who were in his field in Ruth chapter 2. Jonathan said it to David in 1 Samuel chapter 20. David spoke the same in to some faithful in 1 Chronicles 22. Paul says it to the brethren in Thessalonica, 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 16. Go and the Lord be with you. But if Saul has confidence in the Lord's presence and his ability to give victory, then why isn't he going out to meet the giant? He won't go because he doesn't have confidence. This is just simply one of those, it's a thing you say. Sometimes there are things that we say, and we need to think about what we say, right? Go and the Lord be with you. Well, but he doesn't actually have confidence in this. Sometimes people talk spiritual talk, but they don't walk spiritual walk. And that's where Saul is right now. He's saying the right things. Okay, well, Saul, why don't you come and join me? He's not going to go. Saul is not going towards that giant at all, right? And so Saul doesn't believe what he's saying. Before we move on, something else I think we should realize here. Do you see that the king just put the freedom of the entire nation into the hands of a teenager? There's a teenager going out to battle against a big giant. And the future of Israel is dependent upon the outcome of that battle. That sounds crazy. There's a monster of a man over there. He is a man of war, and none of the men of war of Israel are interested in getting involved in this, but it's because David trusts God that he's going to go, and therefore it's not crazy. David's faith is grounded in a history of God delivering his people through means and through people which were not objectively greater than their opponents. Abraham and his household servants in Genesis chapter 14 defeated the combined armies of 4 powerful kings. Who would have thought that would be the outcome, right? People of faith would conclude that will be the outcome. Israel, cornered and weaponless, were delivered from the great Egyptian army at the Red Sea in Exodus chapter 14 because God gave them the victory. It's not that they defeated the enemy. God defeated the enemy. Jericho falls not because Israel were great at fighting, but because they obeyed God and walked around the wall 1 time each day until day 7. They walked around 7 times, and God caused the wall to fall. Gideon and his 300 men, do you remember what they were armed with? They had trumpets, they had clay jars, and they had torches. No weapons. They go out against their enemy, and God gives them victory over the Midianite army, which was 120,000 plus. Judges chapter 7. And there's a whole bunch more examples, right? And so that's why this isn't crazy, because God will use David as the means, and David is objectively less powerful than Goliath. But God is so much more powerful. And God is on David's side. And so Paul, among other biblical writers, indicates this, that the Lord is faithful, who will establish you and guard you from the evil one. 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 3. That's why this will work, because God's on your side. In a different place over in Romans chapter 8, if God is for us, who can be against us? If God is on our side, we have victory guaranteed to us. And so Saul bids David Godspeed, but he's actually not ready to send him yet. You can't go yet. You can't go into battle unequipped. And so Saul dresses David up in his own armor. Well, what an honor, right? To wear the armor of the king. I know it looks sort of weird, but that apparently is the kind of thing that they wore in battle in those days. And I'm not going to take the time to describe it, but there's certain features and reasons and so forth why it is that way. But he gets dressed up in, and Saul's the one who does it. He dresses him up in his own armor. And, certainly if you go into battle with armor, that's better than going into battle without armor, right? Well, David says this, I can't walk in these things. I've not tested them. They're too big for him, by the way, because David is not head and shoulders above everybody else in Israel. That's Saul. And the armor is suited for Saul. And so David goes ahead and he takes them off. And what he does is he takes his staff, which he always has with him because he's a shepherd, and he collects 5 smooth stones from the brook as he goes because he has a sling. And off he goes. Who goes to a sword battle with a sling? Or spear battle? Goliath has both. He's got a javelin over there too. But David goes with the tools that he's familiar with. But he's not putting his trust in the tools. He doesn't trust the sling. He trusts God and God to use him and the sling. Sometimes the conventional things, the innovations, the contraptions, and all those kinds of things serve to encumber and inhibit, when we should just basically fall back on faith, because faith is proven and faith is solid. Saul couldn't imagine him going in without the armor. David couldn't imagine him going in with all this stuff, because God is the one who's going to give the victory anyways. Over in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4, Paul reminds us that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for the pulling down of strongholds. That's what David's confidence was in. God will win this victory. God's going to give the battle to me, not all this gear that he was being dressed up in. And so when David then comes face to face with Goliath, the giant's offended. He's not happy about this at all. And so when he challenged Israel to produce a champion to rise up for them, he wasn't thinking that a teenager was going to show up. This is your champion. And so he bellows out, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? He's talking about David's staff. To Saul, that's just a stick. Yeah, you saw how big he was, right? Well, you come to me with sticks. And so Goliath then curses David by his own gods. And he invites David. He says, come to me and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. David's response is great. It is the embodiment of faith. In verse 45 through 47, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. David did not show up representing himself. That's not why he's there. He was there as a faithful servant and soldier of the Lord, the God of Israel. And Goliath's rhetoric and ranting and slurs against the Lord God, again, he's speaking out against God, not against Israel. He was an affront to God. And for 40 days he's been doing that. David's statement here is not, I will strike you and take your head from you. That's not it. His statement here is, the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you and take your head from you. Those are two very different statements. I understand that part of it is verbatim. But take the Lord out of the picture, and David does not strike Goliath and take his head. It's that simple. David was the tool, the Lord was the warrior. This was God's battle, not David's. There were some lessons to be learned that day. First of all the earth will know that there is a God in Israel. The inference is that the earth has forgotten this, that people don't remember. The days where the earth trembled at the memory of the Exodus or at the victorious conquest of Canaan, those days are gone. The period of the judges was a time of reproach for Israel, and with momentary spots of glory, other nations forgot the power of God throughout that time. This defeat would be spoken far and wide. In fact, here we are about 3,000 years later and 9,000 kilometers away, and we're talking about God defeating Goliath. But notice the second thing he says. All this assembly will know the battle is the Lord's. It's not about swords and spears. It's not about the size of a giant or whoever faces him. The battle is the Lord's. The battle belongs to God. Why is it that for 40 days this giant has been able to speak out against the God of Israel? It's not a man of Israel would rise up, because they thought it was their battle. And when they looked at the battle, we can't win this. You know what? They're right. If they went out there, any one of them by themselves to go against Goliath, he'd strike them dead, because they were not going out in faith. David goes out in faith. David has victory because God honored his faith. The next several verses, we've got the two combatants as they approach one another. David takes a stone from his bag and he slings it at Goliath, strikes him in the forehead. It sinks into his forehead and he falls face first to the ground. God used the sling and the stone of a youth to bring down a skilled giant warrior with his sword and spear and javelin. David then takes Goliath's own sword. The last words that Jeremiah read was David didn't have a sword in his hand. He didn't go out with a sword. He used Goliath's own sword in order to remove the giant's head. And the rest of the Philistines then flee as Israel pursues them. God gave them victory. Now, when's the last time you faced a 9'9" giant? We don't face giants like that, or at least we haven't, right? I suspect that we're not going to. Very unlikely that we'll come face to face with a 9'9" wall of muscle that wants to feed our carcass to the birds. But each of us have our own giants that we do come up against. Things that threaten to defeat and enslave us in some way, things that challenge our faith in God and in his promises, things that might be external to us, such as the increasing call within society for conformity and secularism, things that might be internal to us, fears and doubts and temptations that we face. Whatever the struggle, we don't face it alone. And some giants seem bigger than other giants, but whatever it is, we don't face it alone. We need to face it with faith and have God on our side. We need to focus on the solution, not just the problem. And part of the solution is to realize that our God is greater than the giant. For 40 days, the Israelites were obsessed and were paralyzed about how imposing Goliath was. He's big, I get it. He's strong, yes. He's intimidating. David shows up. David doesn't obsess about the giant. He's focused on God. It doesn't matter if the giant was 20 feet tall. God is still greater. And so we need to have that understanding. God is greater, God is stronger, God is all powerful. At home in our kitchen, we've got this plaque. It says, don't tell God how big your storm is, but tell the storm how big your God is. It's not saying don't pray to God. That's not the point of it. But it's a matter of perspective. We serve a great God who is going to give victory. Hyper focusing on the trouble only amplifies the trouble. It doesn't solve it. But when we get our focus on God and we magnify God instead of the problems, then we find the solutions coming through as God works in us. Faith is not passive, it's active. Notice David's physical response when the giant starts to advance towards him. A lot of people, they see a giant running towards them, they will back away. That's not what David did. So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David that David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Verse 48. Don't hide from trials and struggles. That's not how we overcome them. That's what Israel did for 40 days, as they hid from the struggle that was in front of them. We need to meet the struggles. Procrastination rooted in fear is not a faith response. And so we ought not procrastinate about things that need our attention. Avoiding things because it's uncomfortable, that's not a solution. Biblical faith calls us to actively resist the fear and go forward in the name of God. Over in 2 Timothy 1 verse 7, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Again, with David fighting here, David wasn't fighting for personal fame or notoriety. He was defending the reputation of God. That was what was at issue here. The whole world will know there is a God in Israel. Israel will know that the battle belongs to the Lord. That was his focus, is that people do not glorify God. And so what he did was about the glory of God. The temptation is to defend ourselves and to exalt ourselves and to be perceived as successful by other people, to receive honor. When we face trials, ask, how can God be glorified in my approach to this? Not how do I exalt myself? How do I come out of this looking good? How can God be glorified? 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 11, it says, if anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. If anyone ministers, let him do it with the ability which God supplies, and in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. Again, Peter's focus is always on God and the glory of God. We need to make the right preparations. So David refuses the armor that Saul was offering him, picks up the 5 stones on his way to the battle. Don't rely on things that exalt us. So it's not about our social status or our intellect, our charisma, our strength, or any of those kinds of things. God's already given us an armor. Over in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 14 through 16, stand therefore, having girded your waist with truth, having put on the breastplate of righteousness, having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Above all, take the shield of faith, with which you will be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked one. So equip ourselves with what God supplies. We do that by faith, by having faith in God. And in picking up the 5 stones, as David did, he prepared himself. We need to be sure that we spiritually prepare ourselves. His faith did not make him lazy. He could have sat back and just waited and let's see what God's going to do. That's not the plan. God was going to use David to bring down the giant, but it was still God who was affecting the plan, right? And so he didn't go sit on a hillside and wait for a miracle. He believed in God, and then he went forth in the service of God. Friends, we need to spend time in prayer, spend time in his word, and then we need to go actively do the things that need to be done. And God will bless us in that. And so we want to be imitators of David, because David was a man of faith. David believed in God, believed that God would accomplish his will, that God would give victory. But the fact is that, at least in some respects, I suggest to you that we sometimes find ourselves to be more like the people of Israel in this context than David. That sometimes we're paralyzed by the giants that we face. And so David, in this context, he steps out of obscurity and he fights the battle that they couldn't win, and he achieves the victory that they didn't earn, and so they could share in the triumph that they didn't deserve. That story sounds familiar, because that's actually the story of the New Testament as well. This is emblematic, I believe, also. Yes, we want to focus on David's faith and we want to be imitators of David's faith, but it's emblematic of Jesus, who is the ultimate champion. Jesus stepped onto the battlefield of humanity to face the giants that you and I could not bring down: temptation, sin, shame, and death. We lost those battles. Giants that we were powerless against, that had defeated us. And Jesus comes and he gives victory at Calvary, breaking their power, so that you and I can have victory with him. Hear what David said: the battle is the Lord's. Jesus defeated the devil, and in him we have victory. The battle is the Lord's. Romans 8, verse 37, in all things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. We don't just scrape by. We are granted victory if we will have faith in Jesus Christ and rely upon his victory over the devil, over temptation, over sin, and over death. And so may we have the kind of faith that God calls us to have and rely upon our champion, who is Jesus Christ. If we can help you in your walk with the Lord, we want to do that. If we can be praying for you, opening our Bibles up and studying together, however we can encourage you and help you in your walk of faith. I'm glad that God gave us a family, a spiritual family, so we can encourage and build each other up. So let's be sure to do so. If we can be some help in some way, let us know. Stand and